Beryl Markham was one of the most remarkable women of the 20th century. She flew solo across the Atlantic, had an affair with a prince so scandalous, the crown paid her an annuity to keep her quiet. Abandoned by her mother in Kenya at the age of 5, she roamed the bush with warriors, learned to race horses before she could spell, and survived a lion attack. As a young girl, she could shoot a bow better than the boys, foal horses in the dark, and outride any man. As a woman, her affairs were so shocking they made headlines in both Kenya and England. It was rumored she bore the Prince of England's child. Her first husband, in a jealous rage, attacked an English lord. Another love triangle ended in death and betrayal, where her friend wrote a best-selling book about it that became an Oscar-winning film, erasing Beryl's name entirely. She became the first woman in Africa to earn her pilot's license, flying deep into the bush, saving lives, crossing continents, and soaring through danger. She was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean east to west, becoming a global sensation in the process. But in the moment of her greatest triumph, the man she loved was killed. She snuck barefoot around Buckingham Palace, dodging Queen Mary's gaze, was offered to star in a Hollywood film about her life, wrote a best-selling memoir her husband tried to take credit for, trained racehorses, and partnered with a countess rumored to have killed her 4 husbands. But Beryl Markham was more than scandal. She was a woman who defied gravity and expectation, a record breaker, a rule breaker and a rebel who refused to be tamed. From the red soil of Kenya to the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace, to the skies above the Atlantic and the bright lights of Hollywood. This is the full story of Beryl Markham, the girl who would not fall, the woman who would not break, and the force that flew into history. If you like stories like this, please consider joining the channel, giving a like, or leaving a comment. We have over 70 biographies of remarkable women throughout history on the channel already, with more coming every week. Now let's get into the untamed life of Beryl Markham. Before the girl who would one day fly solo across the Atlantic was even born, the world that would shape her had already begun to fracture. Her father, Charles Baldwin Clutterbuck, was stitched together from contradictions. Classically educated, yet forever unmoored. Born into England's genteel upper middle class, he lived on the edge of elegance and insolvency. Once an officer in the King's Shropshire Light Infantry, Charles had ridden through the farthest reaches of the empire. But charm, no matter how magnetic, cannot balance books. In 1897, under a polite veil of disgrace, he was asked to resign. A talented rider, he turned to training horses. And in the hunting fields of Leicestershire, he met Clara Alexander. She was 19, luminous, with cascading brown hair and a voice like velvet. Heads turned when she entered a room, but it was Charles who held her gaze. They married in 1898, and their first child, Richard, arrived soon after. Then, in October 1902, came a daughter, born not in a manor, but in a modest house in Rutland. For weeks, she remained nameless, as her parents debated what name could possibly match the strange, wild light in her eyes. They called her Beryl, but their love and his credit soon ran dry. Clara longed for salons and society. Charles chased horses in Skye. They drifted from village to village, the most dashing couple to ride to hounds. But glamour, like credit, cannot sustain a marriage. By 1903, the union collapsed. Clara opened a tea shop in Melton Mowbray. Charles stayed behind with the children. Then came his boldest gamble, Africa. To Edwardians with restless ambition, British East Africa was more than a colony. It was a fever dream. In drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs, they whispered of fortunes made and lost, wilderness tamed, kingdoms carved from dust. It was, some said, the new India, but with fewer rules and far greater risk. Charles answered the call. In 1904, just before his departure, he and Clara briefly reconciled, and she agreed to follow him out there, bringing the children. That same year, Charles boarded a steamer bound for the edge of the world. At the turn of the century, Kenya was still a raw frontier. The British had poured fortunes into the Uganda Railway, a steel artery stretching from the Indian Ocean to Lake Victoria. Locals called it the lunatic line, a mad dream forged in sweat, stone, and sacrifice. Now came the crown's most seductive bribe, land. Rich, red volcanic soil, cool highland air, forests that whispered of eternity. Charles arrived in Mombasa in July. The air was thick with bougainvillea and sea salt. Swahili mingled with the shouts of Indian merchants and the haunting cry of the muezzin. Then came the inland train to Nairobi, a ragged outpost of tin roofs and red dust. But to Charles, it shimmered with promise. Through Lord Delamere, one of Kenya's earliest settlers, he found work managing a cattle estate near Njoro. Within months, he acquired 1,000 acres of his own, a sweep of forest clinging to the Mau escarpment, tangled with cedar, olive, and thorn. He named it, perhaps optimistically, Green Hills. There were no roads, no electricity, no grand house. Charles lived in a mud-daub rondavel beside his African workers. At night, lions roared in the valley, elephants trampled crops, antelope grazed where his fields would be, and above it all stretched a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the earth. In late 1905, Clara arrived, bringing Richard and 3-year-old Beryl. It was meant to be a reconciliation, but the dream unraveled quickly. Richard, always delicate, began to fail. Clara, too, withered. The silence, the altitude, the insects, the unrelenting wildness. This was no place for lace gloves and English tea. Within months, Richard was sent back to England with a family friend. 3 months later, Clara followed, this time for good. Beryl would later be told her mother had run off with a man named Harry Kirkpatrick, whom she eventually married. Whether Clara ever meant to return is unknown. Beryl would not see her again until she was an adult. By then, the damage was done. She would never forgive the abandonment. But Kenya would not leave her empty. It would raise her, test her, harden her, and one day lift her into the sky. Her father rarely spoke of the separation. He buried himself in settler routines, training horses, clearing timber, battling weather and debt. Emotion had no place in the highlands. Life was lived at the edge of a machete blade, and so Beryl was left to grow, untethered, sun-browned, and barefoot, beneath the vast skies and blood-red soil of the Mau escarpment. Her childhood was feral, not loveless but boundless. She slept in a rondavel apart from her father's house, surrounded by books, dogs, and the smell of cedar smoke. Her lullabies were hyena laughs and the shriek of cicadas. Her guardians were Kikuyu houseboys, Kipsigis herdsmen, and the land itself. She spoke Swahili as fluently as English. She could track animals before she could write her name. She hurled spears and shot bows better than most boys. Her first friends were African children. Her closest companion was Kibi, the son of her father's herdsman, Arap Mena, a quiet man who watched over Beryl with unspoken devotion. To the Colonials, she was a curiosity. To the Kuyu, she was Memsahib Kidogo, the little mistress. To herself, she was simply free. I had to look after myself, she said. I used to go off and read by myself and think by myself. Funnily enough, it made me. Charles ran Green Hills with the discipline of a cavalryman. He respected Beryl's wildness, but ruled his world with precision. There were no indulgences, no softness, only routine and resilience. They shared a bond not of words, but of rhythm. They rode at dawn, they inspected the horses, they checked the mill. As they rode, he told her stories of ancient Greece, of fate and heroism. It was the closest thing she had to a moral education. But life on the land was a siege against drought, insects, isolation, disease, and lions. Even the earth had to be conquered. Roots ripped out by oxen, anthills crushed with iron picks. At home, Charles taught by example. Beryl idolized him and would spend her life chasing that same stoic, unreachable male energy, whether on horseback in the cockpit or in love. She was a natural rider. She rode all horses on a long rein, her hands steady, her back unshakable. Her best friend was a horse named Pegasus, a foal she helped birth and trained herself. He answered only to her. Together, they galloped across the escarpment and dazzled at gymkhanas. Beryl won race after race, not to prove herself, but because she understood horses better than people. By her early teens, she was sleeping in the stables when mares went into labor. She foaled them down, healed the sick, and rode stallions no one else would touch. One horse, a half-bred brute named Kamsiskan, bit her and threw her into the dust. She stood, wiped the blood from her lip, and got back on. The horses raised by Beryl and Charles won event after event and were the most prized in Kenya. Her education was patchwork, neighbors' wives, local women. She learned to read from Mee's encyclopedia, page by page, and remembered every word. but she preferred riding to reading. Then came Mrs. Emma Orchardson. Charles's divorce had become official, and he was now openly living with Emma, planning marriage. She arrived not just as a governess, but as a new matriarch. Emma believed in order. Beryl believed in the forest. What followed was open war. Beryl refused to live in the main house, retreating to her rendezvous or vanishing into the bush with Kibi. She ignored lessons. Other governesses followed and fled. She placed spiders in their beds. Once, she dropped a dead black mamba on a pillow. A tutor called her wild as a stallion and just as hard to catch. By 10, she had tamed foals, cooked over open fire, skinned antelope, and had survived a lion attack. She could identify warthog dung by scent, mimic bird calls, and walk through tall grass so silently that even antelope didn't flinch. What she didn't know was how to braid her hair or curtsy. In her memoir, West with the Night, Beryl recalls joining Kipsigis warriors on lion hunts, learning their fables by firelight, watching boys become men through ritual and pain. She slept in the bush, a spear at her side, her dog Buller trailing behind. She wore nothing but a lungi tied around her waist, one settler recalled, and carried a spear with her dog Buller by her side. The Africans were her friends, and she was theirs. She walked and moved, another friend said, as though she had wings on her ankles. It wasn't just a childhood, it was an apprenticeship in the wild. Eventually, even Charles bowed to convention. Around age 12, Beryl was sent to a boarding school in Nairobi, a modest institution run by missionary-minded women. For a girl raised by wind and hoofbeats, it was a prison. She loathed the rules, the uniforms, the arithmetic. The other girls stared at her like she was something dragged in from the bush. They cast her as Alice in Wonderland, a curious choice for a girl who had never attended a tea party, never owned a parasol, and carried dust in the creases of her fingers. Her hair was sun-bleached, her skin deeply tanned, her limbs too strong, her bearing too bold. She was too much herself, and the school had no room for that. She lasted 2 years. Officially, she was expelled for disobedience. Unofficially, for being untamable. She returned to Green Hills, unapologetic, undefeated. Her body was strong from labor, feeding, grooming, riding, rising before dawn. She had no close friends. She never forgave her mother. She never accepted Emma. Her emotional solitude deepened, even as her legend grew. Animals were her confidants. Humans a puzzle she never solved. She was brave, but closed. Capable, but alone. Quietly, without fanfare, she visited a clairvoyant. "You will always be successful," the woman told her, "but you will never be happy." Her future circled her like a hawk. The horses had taught her how to fall. The land had taught her how to rise. And loneliness, quiet, relentless, had taught her how to endure. What she lacked in polish, she carried in power. And though she didn't know it yet, the next chapter of her life would begin with a wedding ring. She was 16, tall, sun-bronzed, her voice clipped but soft, her limbs lean from labor and instinct. In another world, she might have stayed wild forever. But in 1918, the world was shifting. The war had ended, and the Empire's sons, wounded, restless, half-broken, began flooding into Kenya. Officers, drifters, dreamers, men lured by land grants and the illusion of beginning again. The soldier settlement scheme offered farms and futures to those who had survived the trenches. With them came the rituals of colonial life reborn: polo, gymkhanas, race meets, and dinners where saddle leather mingled with dust and perfume. And into this world, Beryl was noticed. At race days, at dusty gatherings, she stood apart, taller than most women, sun-browned and composed, her face unreadable. She didn't flirt, didn't gossip, didn't try. Men called her mysterious. Women called her difficult. But no one ignored her. Somewhere between a gymkhana and a Sunday gathering, she met Captain Jock Purves. 13 years older, Scottish, a former rugby star and a veteran of the King's African Rifles. He was solid, well-liked, and crucially connected to her father's affairs. He had worked at Green Hills during a lean season. Some said he had lent Charles money, others whispered that the marriage was a settlement of debt. Charles approved, perhaps he arranged it. As for Beryl, she later recalled it with a shrug. She wasn't in love, but she wasn't opposed. Perhaps she believed that marriage would grant her land, horses, a life of her own. Or perhaps at 16, she simply didn't know what else to do. On October 15, 1919, in a sunlit church in Nairobi, Beryl Clutterbuck became Mrs. Jock Purves. She wore ivory satin and orange blossoms. The newspapers called it a sporting wedding. But for all her height and composure, she was still, quietly, unmistakably, a girl. Their honeymoon took them to India. When they returned, they settled on a farm near Njoro. The sky was still wide, the hills still open, but marriage brought a new kind of silence, one of expectation. She tried, she poured tea, she tended chickens, she smiled at strangers, but her soul remained in the gallops, where hooves struck earth like a metronome for her spirit. That same year, her brother Richard came to visit. She hadn't seen him since childhood. They rode together, laughed easily, and shared memories they thought they'd forgotten. Within months, he was gone. Cerebral malaria, just 21. She rarely spoke of it, but it hollowed her, quietly and completely. Then came the collapse. Her father, once the pride of Kenya's horsemen, was financially ruined. The revalued rupee shattered his accounts, causing his debt to double overnight. Green Hills was sold, the stables emptied, the horses gone. He took a job in Peru. Before he left, he gave Beryl his last 2 mares. Then he too was gone. She was 20, and she was alone. In the years that followed, Beryl rebuilt not only her life, but her name. In 1923, she became the first woman in Kenya licensed as a professional racehorse trainer. It was not a courtesy title, nor a novelty, but something she earned through sweat and skill. She rose before dawn, trained for hours, and understood horses with a depth that defied instruction. She could calm a panicked mare with her voice alone, spot a strained tendon before the animal limped, and coax greatness from creatures no one else dared to handle. Her horses began to win, and they kept winning. Aristocrats sent their finest stock. Officers paid in advance. Settlers waited months to claim a spot in her stables. While other women played hostesses and poured tea, Beryl walked the track with a whip tucked under her arm and her boots dusted red. In England, women were still barred from holding trainers' licenses. In Kenya, there were fewer rules, and no one to tell her no. But even as her reputation soared, her marriage to Jock unraveled. The arguments became louder, the silences longer. Whispers spread through the community. Beryl had taken lovers. She disappeared for days, sometimes weeks, returning without explanation. One man later claimed that every time she strayed, Jock hammered a nail into the frame of their door. Another neighbor recalled hearing plates smash in the dead of night. The stories grew, some perhaps true, others embroidered in the way colonial gossip always was. Eventually, she left him, taking her beloved horse Pegasus and seeking shelter in the circles that had once observed her from a distance. She moved briefly into the orbit of Karen Blixen and Dennis Finch Hatton. Karen, who was affectionately called Tanya, had known her since childhood and now offered her a place to stay. The two women rode together often, bonded by silence, independence, and the wounds they rarely named. In 1924, Beryl's mother Clara returned. Beryl had not seen her mother in over a decade, but Beryl assisted her in finding residence in one of Blixen's cottages, and for a few days, the hope of reconciliation flickered. But it didn't last. Clara complained constantly about the rain, the mold, the lack of servants. Within a week, she packed her trunks and left for Nairobi. Beryl was abandoned again. She spent the next year drifting, from stables to guest rooms, from borrowed cottages to tents under the racecourse stands. She trained 3 horses and did everything herself, feeding, grooming, galloping, and shoeing them with her own hands. Her childhood friend Kibi, now grown and steady, returned to her service and became her right hand. He offered a soft touch when Beryl could be harsh. He called her Madam, always formally, and never once left her side. By 1926, her horses were winning regularly. Her stables had expanded. Her name had become not just respected, but feared. She lived in a stall offered by Lord Delamere, barely more than a converted shed, but it was hers. Clients returned, competitors whispered, and in a world that still viewed women as ornamental, Beryl stood apart, as master of her craft. It was then that she was drawn into the periphery of the Happy Valley set, the restless aristocrats and bohemian castaways who made Kenya their playground. In the Wanjoy Valley, north of Nairobi, they built a society of beauty and ruin. There was Lady Idina Sackville, known for her parties and 5 marriages, Alice de Janzé, who shot herself and her lover only to marry him later, and Kiki Preston, the American heiress known as the Girl with the Silver Syringe. They drank and hunted, danced barefoot at midnight, exchanged lovers like calling cards, and whispered promises into the smoke of opium and cigarettes. Beryl rode their horses. She attended their parties, but she remained, as ever, half in the room and half in the wind. She watched, she listened, but she never lost herself. In March 1927, the society pages buzzed. Beryl was engaged to Robert Fraser Watson, the son of Lord Manton. He was well-born, well-liked, and a rising figure among the settler elite. Their engagement, though brief, was treated like a royal affair. But Beryl rarely appeared at his side. She continued to train, to vanish, to gallop out at dawn alone. Within weeks, the engagement was quietly withdrawn. Scarcely 5 months later, she was engaged again, this time to Mansfield Markham, the impossibly handsome and wealthy heir to a British industrial dynasty. Son of Violet Markham, a suffragist and public figure, Mansfield had come to Kenya in search of escape. Instead, he found Beryl. He was captivated. She was intrigued. Their engagement was no secret, but the timing raised eyebrows. The Times in London printed both engagements side by side, noting the impropriety without comment. Nairobi buzzed. Was Beryl reckless, a gold digger, or simply a woman who refused to follow rules made by others? On Saturday, September 3rd, 1927, Beryl became Mrs. Mansfield Markham. The wedding was held in Nairobi. Lord Delamere gave her away. Karen Blixen lent her the use of her home for the wedding reception. It was a union that spanned empires. Beryl, the self-made horsewoman of East Africa; Mansfield, heir to fortunes built on coal and steel. But was she happy? Mansfield wanted a wife. Beryl had never wanted to belong to anyone. He loved her. She respected him. But the distance between them grew almost from the beginning. Mansfield was young, handsome, and hopelessly enamored. Beryl was composed, unreadable, and by her own admission, not in love. They honeymooned in Paris, then moved into a townhouse in London. He lavished her with Chanel gowns, fox furs, and pearls. She dazzled in salons and hunting lodges, elegant, poised, yet always a little apart, as if observing society through glass. Her formidable mother-in-law, Violet Markham, arranged her presentation at court. And so, despite the whispered disapproval of divorcees in royal company, Beryl stood beneath chandeliers, bowed before King George and Queen Mary, and was declared suitable. But the facade was already beginning to crack. During the Leicestershire hunting season, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, noticed her. She was impossible to ignore. Tall, radiant, and impervious to flattery. They began to ride together. Then came dinners, laughter, and eventually letters. An affair began. Beryl tied his racing colors to her dog's collar, introduced him to her circle at the London Aeroplane Club, and shared with him the freedom she had always reserved for herself. He gave her companionship. She gave him escape. For a time, they were happy, if not safe. By the following year, Beryl and Mansfield had returned to Kenya. They bought bloodstock, built stables, and entertained beneath the Rift Valley sky. He paid off Charles Clutterbuck's debts, and her father returned to Kenya to work beside her. In public, Beryl and Mansfield performed the roles expected of them with grace and precision. But behind the champagne and racing forms, the fracture between them deepened. Mansfield longed for structure, children, and a wife who would reflect his family name with polish. Beryl resisted anything that asked her to be smaller than she was. She began slipping back into the shadows of her former life, into the bush, into bars, into the arms of other men. Late in 1928, she discovered she was pregnant. She was furious. Abortion was considered. Mansfield, long suspicious of her relationship with Prince Henry, was enraged. Their arguments grew venomous. During one, she reportedly snapped, "You don't even know that it's yours anyway, so why should you worry?" That autumn, Prince Edward and Prince Henry arrived in Kenya for a royal safari. Beryl, despite the growing scandal, was asked to help organize the events surrounding their visit. There were parties, races, dinners, and at nearly every one, she and Henry were inseparable. She was visibly pregnant, yet seemingly unconcerned. They were often seated together, laughing, drinking, oblivious to, or perhaps defiant of, the attention. The affair was no longer whispered, it was observed. In mid-November, Beryl sailed to England to give birth. On March 25, 1929, she had a son. She named him Gervase. Rumors swirled almost immediately, even within the Markham family, that the child was Prince Henry's. But the timeline made this nearly impossible. Beryl had returned to Kenya more than a year before Gervais's birth and had not seen the prince until 5 months prior, well after the child had been conceived. Still, she never denied the gossip. Her silence only deepened the mystery. During her recovery, she spent time with Henry in London. She visited him at Buckingham Palace, entering through the servants' entrance. On one occasion, she was forced to hide in a cupboard when Queen Mary arrived unexpectedly. One friend recalled her barefoot in the corridors, moving like a Nandi warrior in pearls. On the eve of Henry's departure for Japan, they exchanged gifts. She gave him a silver cigarette case engraved with a single line of quiet sorrow. They were seen at races, at parties, laughing openly, walking side by side. The gossip was no longer speculative. It was breathless. In late 1929, Mansfield, armed with letters and humiliation, prepared to file for divorce. He intended to name Prince Henry as co-respondent. It was no longer merely scandal, it was peril. A king's son accused of adultery in open court would have shattered the monarchy. Headlines would have stretched from Fleet Street to Cape Town. Queen Mary stepped in. There would be no trial, no court, no headlines, only silence. Behind closed doors, a settlement was arranged. £15,000, a staggering sum, was paid, almost certainly from Prince Henry's private funds. A trust was created. Beryl would receive £750 annually, quietly and without acknowledgement. Mansfield was released from financial obligation. The terms were never written, but perfectly understood. She would not return to England, she would not speak of the affair, and she would disappear, gracefully. By 28, Beryl had worn pearls in Paris, flown through scandal, and walked barefoot through Buckingham Palace. She had been adorned, adored, and abandoned. She had conquered horses, land, and men, and found nothing among them that could hold her. So she looked up. What remained was the sky, and a love affair that would rupture her world, destroy her closest friendship, and leave her in a silence of her own making. When Beryl returned to Kenya in early 1930, she stepped off the boat as a woman out of place. She had walked away from her marriage, left her son in the care of a mother-in-law who had never wanted her, and slipped out of London society beneath a cloud of disgrace. Kenya had once been her beginning. Now it was her exile. Nairobi offered no welcome. Friends who had once leaned across tea tables to whisper gossip now crossed the street. Invitations vanished. Eyes followed her in public, but no hands reached out. Only one door remained open. Karen Blixen, who had offered Beryl refuge once before, opened her doors again. Her house on the Ngong Hills became a place of quiet reprieve. Low fires, long silences, and the gentle dignity of shared understanding. Their friendship had never been sentimental. It was built on something rarer: recognition. Two women accustomed to being misread, both bound to a land they could never truly own, and both still quietly tethered to men who would not stay. They rode together, often without speaking. Early morning canters along the ridgelines, the Rift Valley spreading out beneath them like a memory. Words weren't necessary. Rhythm and dust were enough. It was a rare kind of intimacy, unpossessive, unspoken, and, for a moment, complete. At the time, Karen was still in love with Dennis Finch Hatton, a man as elusive as he was lion-hearted. He came and went like weather, never lingering long. Their relationship had always been fragile, Karen's longing met by his distance, her rootedness by his need to roam. He taught her Latin, shared books, vanished for weeks. She had miscarried twice. She loved him with a devotion that frightened even her, but he belonged to no one. Beryl, for her part, had long admired Dennis from afar. He had been, to her, a figure of quiet reverence, a man who moved through the world with grace, restraint, and something close to flight. Now, for the first time, she felt something she had always resisted, the aching pull of emotion. Their closeness grew not from seduction, but from understanding. For a brief time, Dennis became everything: mentor, brother, lover, friend. He took her flying. They soared above the Rift Valley, the Mao rising behind them, the scorched plains stretching out below like pages of a story. The sound of the engine, the thin wind against the fuselage, the unbound sky. They dined by firelight. He read poetry aloud to her. She taught him to see Kenya not as an escape from England, but as a homeland. There was never the kind of love between them that he had once shared with Karen, but for a fleeting season between safaris, they belonged to one another. They rode, they drank, they danced, they laughed. And for the first time in her life, Beryl felt something close to happiness, and she knew, even then, that it would not last. Unlike Karen, Beryl had no desire to keep Dennis. She didn't ask for permanence, didn't seek a promise. It was a delicate, perfect balance, and it was always going to break. After flying several times with Dennis, Beryl asked him to teach her. He refused. Flying, to him, was sacred, solitary, not something to be shared. So she turned to someone else. Tom Campbell Black, once a daring horseman, now a lean, exacting director at Wilson Airways. He had made headlines for rescuing German ace Ernst Udet from the Sudanese desert, a story Beryl had followed with fascination. Tom was not charming. He didn't flatter. He didn't tolerate laziness. He believed flying was the future, and that it required discipline. When Beryl asked him to teach her, he studied her for a moment and said, "Only if you work harder than anyone else." She agreed, and she meant it. Her classroom was a hangar in a field. Her desk, the cockpit of a gypsy moth, little more than canvas and wire. Tom was relentless. No drinking, no excuses, no shortcuts. She memorized wind speeds, practiced stalls, and studied the feel of pressure on her skin. Circuits and bumps, Tom repeated. Take off, land, again and again. She didn't want praise. She wanted skill. Her body understood first, the tilt of the wings, the subtle shift before lift, the second before a stall. Her mind followed. In the sky, there was no scandal, no husband, no son, no shame. After just over 8 hours of dual instruction, Tom told her she was ready. She said nothing, just climbed in. The runway was hard dirt, barely marked. Sometimes animals wandered across it. She took off, circled once, and came back down, clean and smooth. There was no applause, just Tom's nod, and the faintest flicker of a smile. In the weeks that followed, Karen prepared to return to Europe. Dennis had planned a scouting trip along the Takonga River, a route not yet surveyed by air. He believed it could revolutionize safari work. Karen asked to go. He refused, said the bush would be rough, that they might have to sleep out. They argued briefly and bitterly. Then he kissed her goodbye and left for Nairobi. Before he departed, he asked Beryl if she wanted to come. He thought she'd enjoy it, the wildness, the flying, the firelight under an open sky. And for a moment she considered it. She pictured the night in the bush, the silence between stars, his voice in the dark. But she had a dual instruction flight scheduled the next day, something she had worked toward for weeks. And Tom had made it clear, flying required discipline. She declined. On May 14th, 1931, after several days of flying and visiting friends, Dennis took off from Voi, heading back toward Nairobi. His plane circled twice before leaving, once tightly, once more slowly. It tilted, wobbled, almost like a farewell. Then it dipped and never rose again. The aircraft spun, spiraled, and crashed just beyond the ridge. It burst into flames on impact. Dennis and his passenger were killed instantly. The funeral was arranged hastily. He was buried high in the Ngong Hills, on the ridge where he and Karen had once stood, watching the sun fall behind the valley. He had once said he'd like to rest there. That day, the hill was veiled in cloud. Karen's grief was terrible to witness. She looked spectral, her skin chalk pale, her body diminished. People wept for her as if she had been a widow, though she had never worn a ring. Beryl stood apart. She said nothing. No one spoke to her. She was not composed nor visibly broken, only still like stone, unmoving beneath the weight of what could not be said. She was the other woman, the figure in the wings, the silence inside the scandal. No one made space for her sorrow, so she carried it alone. In Blixen's memoir, Out of Africa, Beryl is never mentioned. After the funeral, Beryl vanished into the hills. For weeks, she rode, worked with horses, stayed far from Nairobi. She needed hooves, sweat, rhythm, things that didn't speak, things that didn't ask, and then she returned. She came back to Nairobi, back to Tom, back to flying, not slowly, not cautiously, but with fire. Tom would later say he had never seen such focus, such hunger, as if something in her had cracked and whatever remained had chosen the sky. She had known love, and it had ended in fire. She had known betrayal, and it had ended in silence. She had known motherhood, and it had ended in absence. But flight had given her something else. Not peace, not healing, purpose, and purpose would carry her farther than love ever had. It was around this time that Tom Campbell Black began to matter. Tom had already made his name, former RAF officer, co-founder of Wilson Airways, and one of the most skilled pilots in East Africa. He flew without flourish and without ego, with a level of discipline Beryl recognized instantly. He was precise, principled, and utterly unromantic, which perhaps is why she trusted him. Their connection began in the cockpit. He was her teacher. She was his most determined student. He gave instructions without condescension. She received them without pride. There was no flirtation, no tension, just rhythm. He would gesture, she would adjust, he would map a route, and she would find her way back, clean, exact, graceful. But over time, the rhythm extended beyond the air. They spent their days flying, riding, and dancing. It was not a courtship. It was companionship, deepening into the only love she would later name. He made no promises. She needed none. But she felt safer with him than she ever had before. There were no performances, no contests of will. There was just presence, and quietly, devotion. By mid-1931, Beryl had completed her solo flight. Soon, she was flying for Wilson Airways. Mail runs, supply drops, occasional safaris, through weather, terrain, and silence that would have broken lesser pilots. Her aircraft was a gypsy moth. Canvas wings, open cockpit, no radio. There were no towers, no beacons, no guarantees. Sometimes in the bush, by the campfire, she and Tom would talk about the other flying couples, Johnson and Mollison, Amy and Jim, and the records they chased across oceans and continents. They laughed, speculated, and imagined what they might do too. Not for glory, but for the thrill of charting something no one else had dared. What they never said aloud, what flickered in the hush between firelight and stars, was Beryl's quietest hope, that this, finally, was the kind of love that wouldn't leave. As her reputation grew, Tom began to drift. He had taken a post as private pilot to Lord and Lady Furness, flying frequently between England and Africa. Beryl, missing him, decided to attempt to fly solo to England. She prepared her aircraft. No press release, no farewell. Just her, a second-hand gypsy moth, and the sky. The journey was long, solitary, and dangerous. She flew across dust-choked deserts, into storms that tore at the wings, through mechanical failures and blinding heat. Once she landed in soft sand and had to enlist strangers to drag the plane to firmer ground. Another time, a cracked piston threatened to end the flight entirely. Still, she flew on: Alexandria, Tripoli, Malta, Naples, Paris. On the 7th day, she reached London. She told the press she had come to visit friends. She wasn't selling a story or chasing a headline. She had simply arrived, sun-browned, wind-burned, lean, and unbothered. There were interviews, a scattering of parties, a small wave of curiosity. And then came Tom. They flew together at the King's Cup air races. They laughed, they performed. But something had changed. He was still Tom, steady, courteous, capable, but the warmth had cooled. He was no longer reaching for her. She didn't say it, but she felt it, the beginning of goodbye. The next day at a reception, she met Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the French pilot who would one day write The Little Prince. They spoke of flight, of stillness, of the sky as both freedom and exile. She saw her son, now 3. She was gentle, careful, kind, but made no move to take him back. Back in Nairobi, Beryl resumed her work. Mail, supplies, surveyors, delivered to places barely marked on maps. She flew over elephant herds and riverbeds, railway lines and thorn scrub, through sun glare and storm. It was dangerous work, often unpaid. But it was hers. Gradually, people began to speak of her differently. She was no longer the woman who left a prince, no longer the mother who walked away. She was the pilot who flew through storms, who landed where others wouldn't, who never asked for recognition, and never needed to. Tom returned to Africa when he could, still flying for the Furnaces, still collecting accolades. When he came back, they resumed their rhythm. Quiet rides, soft laughter, dances under the highland moon. Their love needed no declaration. It existed, calm and enduring. But Beryl had changed. She had never felt more capable, more free, or more in love. When Tom left again for London, they made a quiet promise. She would follow soon. The separation would only be for a while. But what she didn't know was that their love story had ended. Beryl was fastidious about her appearance. She had her hair lightened and her nails manicured regularly. Her uniform was famous: a white silk shirt, a cravat at the collar, loose white slacks that framed her long, striking legs. With her pale skin, light eyes, and theatrical confidence, she could have passed for a society woman playing at adventure. But flying was no game to her. She knew exactly the impression she made, and she wasn't displeased by it. There were stories, always stories. One told of a man stranded in the bush for days with a broken ankle, waiting for help. At last, he heard the whine of an aircraft, thin, high, improbable. A blue and silver avian touched down in the clearing. He limped forward, expecting a helmeted man in khakis. Instead, Beryl stepped from the cockpit, tall, blonde, dressed in white, her nails immaculate, her grin unconcerned. She handed him a bottle of gin, her cure-all for bush-bound hunters. He must have thought he'd died and gone to heaven, one old-timer recalled. She ran her freelance flying business with the same quiet efficiency that had once defined her training yard. She was the first in East Africa to offer aerial elephant scouting as a commercial service. She had no radio, no direction-finding equipment. Her cockpit had only a compass, a turn-and-bank indicator, and an altimeter. If she went down in the bush, no one would know where to look. In January 1934, Ernest Hemingway arrived in Kenya on safari with Philip Percival, the same white hunter who had guided Theodore Roosevelt. Hemingway fell ill, dysentery, then complications. He was flown out in a rescue plane. The experience stayed with him. Years later, he would write of that flight in the snows of Kilimanjaro. During his recovery, he met Karen Blixen. Through her, he met Beryl. Hemingway, writing much later, would say, "I knew her fairly well in Africa." When the safari season ended, Beryl returned to charter work, hauling passengers to remote farms, delivering supplies, ferrying doctors to distant patients. She still competed in gymkhanas, her name often appearing in the prize lists for jumping events. In April 1934, she flew alongside some of the region's best-known pilots. She won a prize for precision landing and later claimed the trophy for the aerial derby, a 30-mile race that left others off course. Beryl finished minutes ahead, and as the sun set, she joined the crowd at the clubhouse, where they danced until morning. In early spring, word reached Kenya that Tom had entered the upcoming race from London to Melbourne. Beryl, thrilled by the news, wrote to him almost immediately. She had always imagined the two of them flying together. Something bold, something dangerous, something shared. The letters that survive from Tom during this time read more like essays than correspondence. He said little about her, about them. The distance in his words was hard to ignore. Still, he had written that he would return to Kenya after the race. A race like this felt like the kind of story they'd once promised to write. His reply came quickly, courteous, measured, gracious, but not warm, not personal. But she wanted more than reassurance. She wanted to see him. When the idea of going to England became irresistible, she turned to a familiar friend. Bror Blixen arranged for his nephew, Gustav Romulus Kleen, to cover expenses if Beryl would fly him to Europe. The plan came together quickly. Romulus stayed at her cottage. Together, they prepared to leave by mid-April. But on the day of departure, torrential rains flooded the airstrip. The flight was delayed. The next day, Beryl collapsed with malaria. It came fast and brutal. Fever, chills, delirium. She refused hospitalization. Instead, she stayed at Muthaiga, cared for by Arap Ruda, formerly Kibi. She was grounded for months. It wasn't until November that she returned to serious work. She was back scouting elephants, flying long routes, taking the kinds of risks that had once made her infamous. The pay was better now, sometimes twice the charter rate, but the danger was greater. If she crashed out there, she would be hard to find, harder to reach, and unlikely to survive. Meanwhile, Tom's name had begun appearing in newspapers beside another woman's. In August, he had flown Lord Furness to the races. It was there he met her, Florence Desmond, a bright-eyed comedy actress just off a triumphant stage run. They met at dinner. He told her about the Melbourne race, 11,000 miles in 3 days. She laughed, thought he was joking. But by the end of the evening, he had her attention. And not long after, he had her affection. When she returned to England, he phoned her at her cottage in Hertfordshire. She invited him down. He said he'd fly. "Put a white sheet in the biggest field," he told her, "so I know where to land." As the race approached, the visits continued. By October, when Tom took off from Melbourne, his feelings for Florence, Desi, as everyone called her, ran deep. The day before he left, he asked her to marry him. She didn't answer, not yet. She told him she'd decide when he came back. And then he won. Tom and Charles Scott flew from London to Melbourne in 2 days, 22 hours and 59 minutes. They set a record. They made headlines. The world called it a triumph. Beryl had expected him to come flying back into her life. She had been proud, genuinely, fiercely proud. She flew north to tell her father the news as soon as she heard. Everyone in Nairobi knew Tom was Beryl's man. So when she read the article, Air Race Romance, her first thought was that it had to be publicity. A planted story, a misunderstanding. Surely Tom hadn't proposed to Florence Desmond, the actress. That wasn't their story. That wasn't him. She scribbled a note. She sent a telegram. "Darling, is it true you are to marry Florence Desmond? Please answer. Stop. Heartbroken. Beryl." There was no answer, just silence. And in that silence, something ended. In the spring of 1935, Tom married Florence Desmond. He wrote to Beryl not long after. His tone was gentle. He asked her to stop scouting in elephant country. He knew about her malaria. He knew she wouldn't listen. He said he was planning more records. London to Cape Town and back. London to New York. London to Hong Kong. Beryl said little about the letter. Only that she was glad he was finally doing what he had always dreamed of. But something in her had shifted. She took every job, no matter how remote, how dangerous, how thankless. She flew where no one else would, not to forget, not to grieve, but because she had a plan of her own. She flew deeper into safari work, chartered bush flights, and the dangerous scouting runs that took her across terrain no other pilot wanted. While Tom's name appeared in racing bulletins and society pages, she flew low over the scrub, skimming riverbeds and elephant trails, photographing the land from a cockpit with no backup and no radio. She read of his successes and felt herself edged out of the adventure. Not just the romance, but the momentum, the sense of belonging to something greater than routine. She had loved him, and she had found something rare in those years they shared, even at a distance. His rejection, his marriage to Desi, had hurt deeply. But what hurt more was the feeling that she had been left out of the story, that he had gone on without her, and that the part she'd played had been quietly edited out. And so she planned. She took on more work and more risk. Most of her time now was spent alone in the air, flying elephant trails, guiding clients to the great tuskers still hiding in the forest. There were no more social headlines, no more scandal, only the clean silence of competence. By February, she had made her decision. She arranged to sell the Avian at auction to fund a return to England. And with the death of the old king and Prince Henry safely married, there were no more obligations to stay away. Before leaving, she flew to visit her father to say goodbye. More painful was the goodbye to Arap Ruta, her mechanic, her shadow, her lifelong witness. He had been with her through everything. First as a boy in the stables, then in her marriage, then in the hangar. He had followed her from horses to engines, always there, always silent. Now she was leaving him. In 1936, she arrived in England. Thanks to Tom, there were interviews waiting for her. Job offers, newspaper requests, handshakes from men who had once ignored her. But she didn't go for work. She went for the sky. She was no longer chasing love. She was chasing her place in history. Beryl easily found work. She flew charters, piloting a twin-engine de Havilland Dragon between Paris, Deauville, and country estates. The work was easy. The pay was good, but it wasn't enough. She dined occasionally with Mansfield. He asked for a divorce. She refused. She saw her son again, 6 years old now. Every night he waited at the top of the stairs for her arrival to kiss him goodnight. Often she wouldn't show. Over time, the nanny grew firm. One couldn't always depend on the fact that Mummy would turn up. And the visits stopped entirely. She kept flying. In London, her name still circulated. Old headlines, old scandals, but she was no longer a novelty. She logged hours, flew quietly, studied charts. Something was forming, though she said nothing. Not yet. Then came the offer. At dinner one evening, John Carberry, a wealthy, eccentric friend from Kenya, spoke of his new aircraft, a custom-built Percival Vega Gull. It was being prepared for the Cape race to Johannesburg, but if she wanted, she could borrow it. Try something harder, something no woman had ever done. England to New York. Solo, non-stop, against the wind. She accepted immediately. The east-to-west crossing had never been completed by a woman. Amelia Earhart had crossed the Atlantic in 1932, but with the wind at her back. Beryl would face storms, fog, and headwinds for thousands of miles. Several had died trying. She had no sponsors, no press agent, just a plane, a route, and a reason. Tom helped oversee her training. She stayed at Aldenham House, ran miles each morning, studied weather charts at night. There was no drinking, no distractions. Her body was prepared, so was her mind. The aircraft, the Messenger, was beautiful but basic. No radio, no navigation beacons, a single fuel gauge. The auxiliary tanks would have to be switched manually midair in precise order. One mistake could stall the engine or unbalance the aircraft. She trained with quiet focus. This was not a stunt. It was a job, and she meant to do it well. By late August, the papers had found her. They called her Flying Mother, Daredevil Beauty, Society Girl in the Sky. She read them with irritation. She was 33. She had logged over 2,000 hours. She could strip down an engine and put it back together again. She had flown through dust storms, monsoons, and heat so thick it shimmered off the wing struts like oil. She wrote her own piece for the Daily Express. I am not doing this as a woman, not as a society girl, not for fame. I have a job, I am a pilot, and I want to prove something. For British aircraft, for British pilots, and for myself. On September 2nd, she dined with Tom and her friend Rose. It felt like a farewell. Rose would later remember her with quiet awe. We were all frightened for her, but she wasn't. Not when she rode the wildest horse, not when she flew into storms. Jim Mollison gave her a watch, one that had crossed the Atlantic twice. She was already wearing her own, but he insisted. One for Greenwich Mean Time, one for New York, just to keep hold of the world as it turned beneath her. The next day, fog blanketed the airfields. She waited by the phone. Everything else was ready. The Messenger was full. The press circled like crows. And then on the 4th of September, the forecast lifted, marginally. Squalls, headwinds, but flyable. She arrived just before 5. A bomber had overturned at Abingdon, blocking the runway. Crews worked to clear the debris. She stood by the hangar, chain smoking. I'm glad I didn't see it, she muttered. That same wind, that's what I'm taking off into. She looked pale, drawn, but calm. No life jacket. Too bulky, she said. I'd rather be warm. She handed the Daily Express reporter a sealed letter, then stepped toward the plane. Chicken sandwiches, dried fruit, 5 flasks of tea and coffee, a bottle of water, a flask of brandy, a sprig of heather. The runway was 1 mile long, marked with flags, one red, the point of no return. The engine caught on the first swing. She taxied. The Messenger rolled forward, slow at first, then faster, its tail lifting, wind clawing at the wings. The red flag came near. Still, she held her line. And then, clean as a whisper, she rose. Her hand appeared through the cockpit window and waved. Then, she was gone. She had been in the air less than an hour when the light began to vanish. Clouds thickened, low, gray, dense as smoke. The horizon dissolved. The sea disappeared beneath a sheet of mist. She had no view, only motion. The wind, once steady, turned against her. It hammered the nose of the aircraft like a fist. The Messenger bucked. Then again. She kept her grip firm, adjusted. The corrections didn't hold. She tried again. Her wrist ached. The plane felt unwilling, heavy in the air, slow to respond. Every climb became labor. Every motion, a question. She reached for her chart. A gust punched through the cockpit. The paper fluttered once, then vanished, swept into the gray. She watched it go, a pale square tumbling into the void. She didn't curse, but her throat tightened. There was nothing on that chart but water. The engine strained, grinding against the wind. The sky closed around her. No sea, no sky, just the hiss of rain and the groan of canvas and wood. Her instruments held steady. That was something. But the air felt thick, like flying through sleep. Her body moved by memory. This was expected, she told herself. She had flown in worse. She had told herself that. But this was different. It was too early to be tired, and yet her arms were heavy. Her boots were damp. The cold had crept into the hollows of her gloves. No panic, not yet. Just a thought, rising beneath the drone. You've only just begun, and it already feels like this. The last thread of horizon vanished. The sea below became a theory. Darkness folded into darkness. She was inside a storm. Not furious, just infinite. Wind, sleet, the rattle of struts. The engine, faithful but straining. She was flying blind, no landmarks, no light. Just the quiet sway of instruments, like pendulums swinging in a crypt. Her mouth was dry, her spine damp, her thoughts narrowing, drawing in around the single fact of forward motion. Then came the lightning and the sky tore open. The messenger lurched, the controls slackened. She glanced sideways. The sea was above her. She was upside down. She didn't shout. She didn't panic. She moved, calm, measured, pulled gently, let gravity lend its hand, rolled the plane level. The weight returned. The wind caught. The dark closed in again. The storm resumed its hush. Her back ached. Her legs were numb. Her breath was shallow. This was the middle part, the part no one spoke of. Not the lift, not the landing, just endurance. She had known loneliness before, on verandas, in marriage beds, at tables where conversation dropped when she entered. But this was different. This was the kind of loneliness that made you question if you existed at all. A speck of metal and willpower. A dot against the sky. A line drawn across the world, trying not to vanish. She didn't know how long she'd been flying. Her body had become part of the machine, fused to the cockpit, stitched to the stick. Her thoughts reduced to rhythm. Airspeed, altitude, fuel, drift, everything else had been scraped away. She reached for her last flask of coffee. Her fingers were stiff. The cap slid open. She brought it to her lips. Then, turbulence. A jolt to the right. The flask slipped. She felt the heat first, coffee soaking her thigh, then disappearing into the padding of the seat. It was gone. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. Her jaw clenched, her stomach curled inward. She didn't cry, but she was very close. She adjusted for drift. Again. The plane kept pulling right, not enough to scream, just enough to whisper. She checked her gauges, ran the numbers. Something wasn't right. Fuel, weight, wind. She recalculated. The messenger held steady, still flying, still whole. But she wasn't sure that she was. She thought of England behind her, of Tom likely asleep, unaware, of Gervais, too young to know where his mother had gone. She didn't think of dying, she thought about stopping. And then, almost too subtly to notice, the wind shifted. The nose steadied. The wings relaxed. The groan of the engine softened, not in volume but in tone. And ahead, distant, pale, a break in the dark. The first edge of dawn. Through thinning mist, a jagged line. Land. The word struck like a bell in her mind. She circled, once, then again. Below, sea. Ahead, Cape Race. Clouds, no longer walls, began to pull apart like curtains. She adjusted her heading, felt the plane shudder in the crosswind. But it held. She was off course, not badly, but enough. She checked fuel. Not gone, but low. Too low to reach New York. She knew then, quietly, without fear. There would be no grand arrival, no applause, no cameras, just a landing, somewhere. She scanned the coast, anything, a field, a road, a clearing. She didn't think of records, of men, of headlines. She thought of margin, of wind direction, of gravity. The voice in her head had become someone else's, Tom's maybe, or her father's, a calm, unspoken rhythm she trusted. The messenger held on, but the coastline offered no welcome, just trees, rocks, marsh, water. The engine coughed once, the gauge needle wavered, she dropped lower, and then there, a patch, not ideal, not safe, but maybe enough. She circled again, lined up, felt the wind press at the wings, adjusted, trimmed, focused. The messenger resisted. She descended, cut the throttle. The ground rushed up, impact. The wheels sank into soft ground, too soft. Bog. The nose pitched forward, her head hit the frame. The messenger groaned, then stilled. Rain tapped gently against the glass. Her breath returned, her hands trembled, her forehead stung. But she was alive. She opened the cockpit. The air outside was cold, wet, still. She stepped down, boots sinking into the soaked moss, legs unsteady, vision swimming. Around her nothing but mist and wilderness. No road, no voices, no direction. She started walking, one foot, then another. Not out of panic, not for show, just forward. And then voices. Two fishermen blinking through the drizzle stared as she emerged from the bog. Her face was pale, streaked with blood. Her oil-streaked white clothes clung to her frame like myth-made flesh. She met their gaze and in the quietest, most ordinary voice said, "I'm Mrs. Markham. I've just flown from England." News of her takeoff reached the press the morning after she disappeared into cloud. Mrs. Markham has gone, the headlines read, printed in cautious optimism above a handful of dry facts. She had lifted off at 5 p.m. British time. The plane had been sighted over Castletown, County Cork at 10:25. And then, nothing. No word, no message, no wreckage. Just the long, uncertain silence of sky. At Floyd Bennett Field in New York, a crowd of 2,000 gathered, watching the clouds with narrowed eyes. They brought newspapers and radios, umbrellas and blankets. They stood quietly, heads tilted upward, waiting for a glint of silver to break the horizon. She was late. She was lost. Rumors moved through the crowd like waves. Someone claimed she'd been seen near Nova Scotia. Another said she'd gone down in the sea. Hopes rose and fell in turn. No one knew anything. In England, the phone lines hummed. Then, just after 2 in the afternoon, a faint message crossed the Atlantic. A Dutch freighter had spotted a small aircraft over the ocean, low and westbound. The coordinates placed it 1,500 miles from her destination, but still airborne, still flying. Another ship confirmed it, then a third. At 9:35 a.m., a plane was seen circling above Newfoundland, lingering over Cape Race before vanishing again into the cloud. And then the silence returned, hours of it. Back in New York, the fog thickened. Radios crackled, eyes strained skyward. Rumors returned. She was 5 hours out. She was dead. She'd landed in Canada. She hadn't landed at all. And then, at last, a phone call. From a village so small, most maps forgot it, tucked into the edge of Cape Breton Island, a voice reported, "Mrs. Markham has landed. She is alive." She had crossed the Atlantic, alone, from east to west, the first woman in history to do so. It wasn't the arrival anyone had imagined. No grandstands. No salute. Just 2 fishermen in a bog, blinking in the drizzle beside a plane with its nose in the dirt. She was bloodied, exhausted, shaking. But she had landed, and she had survived. The silence that had stretched across oceans and hours cracked wide open, and the world woke to her name. First woman flies Atlantic east to west. Society mother conquers ocean, flying beauty safe after 22 hours in the sky. The headlines came fast. Editors scrambled for photographs. Radio hosts practiced pronunciations. Reporters dug up old columns, searching for something, anything, that might explain how Beryl Markham had taken off alone and landed in a bog, rewriting history in a single flight. She hadn't meant to become a symbol. But there she was, mud-streaked, bruised, forehead bleeding, asking 2 strangers if there was a telephone nearby. Telegrams raced towards her. The mayor of New York had cabled congratulations. Amelia Earhart wrote a note. And someone else, impossibly, had sent a letter signed with a paw print. All she knew was that she had made it, not far, not where she meant to, but far enough. From Halifax, a U.S. Coast Guard plane flew her south. At Floyd Bennett Field, 5,000 people were waiting, far more than when she'd been only a rumor in the sky. She stepped from the plane looking strangely composed. Her borrowed clothes hung loose. A fresh bandage covered the cut on her forehead. Her eyes were steady, her hair tousled. She looked like someone returning from war. At the airport, she borrowed a compact, powdered her face, applied a swipe of lipstick with steady hands. A reporter offered her orange juice. "I think I'd like something stronger," she said. "A champagne cocktail." That night, she stood under the lights at the Avon Theater on West 45th Street for a live radio interview. The crowd applauded. She looked stunned by the sound. "I'd rather fly the Atlantic again than speak on the radio," she admitted. In a newsreel clip, she clasped her hands behind her back and gave a crooked smile. "Did you drink anything, Mrs. Markham?" "Yes, I did." "Just one?" "No," she said. 2 swigs, I'm afraid." She was no longer the society scandal, the divorcee, the mother who had left. She was now something stranger, an icon in borrowed clothes, holding court in a hotel suite she hadn't asked for. But in the quiet moments between interviews, between telegrams and toasts, she allowed herself a private truth. She had done something no one had ever done, something no one could take away. And for the girl who had once run barefoot through the red soil of Kenya, that, just that, was everything. The night before, she had stood beneath 1,000 lights, each one a star in a galaxy of fleeting illusions. There had been champagne in New York, too much champagne, and borrowed lipstick, smeared a little too carelessly. A dress that didn't belong to her, shimmering under the lights, slipping in and out of her true self. A motorcade had swept her through the city like a queen reborn, the crowd parting to make way. People leaned from windows, faces pressed to glass, straining for a glimpse of something rare. Strangers raised their glasses, their cheers mingling in the night air like a forgotten song. She had smiled. She had accepted the flowers. She had played her part. But in the morning, the phone rang. The awful, jagged sound of it ringing too early, too abruptly, ripping her from the half-dream she had carried into the new day. The pit formed instantly in her stomach. A stone dropped into the deepest well. It was Jim. There was no hesitation in his voice, no attempt to soften the words. It was the truth, bare, raw, and unyielding. Tom's dead. A test flight in Liverpool. A new aircraft, a bomber landing too fast, too blind. Its path crossed his. The propeller, catching the cockpit, tearing through his world with the suddenness of lightning. Instant, final. There was no time, no warning, no space to survive. Tom hadn't done anything wrong. He had simply been in the way. She didn't drop the phone. She didn't cry, but something, quietly, imperceptibly, shifted inside her. A piece of her, once held together with grace and precision, broke loose. It didn't fall. It just shifted and never returned to its place. She sat, and the world, once roaring with celebration, full of clinking glasses and bright voices, fell into unbearable stillness. An unnatural silence settled over her like a weight she could never shake. She didn't picture the wreckage. She didn't imagine the twisted metal, the smoke, or the chaos. Instead, she thought of him as he had been. Tom, calling her Markham, even when it wasn't necessary. His shirt's always a bit too white, his voice dry with instruction, never with praise. The nights alone watching the sunset over the mountains, she remembered his hands. Always a little too quick, always already holding the tool before she needed it. He hadn't been there at takeoff. He hadn't said goodbye. And now, he never would. She canceled everything. The interviews, the dinners, the studio offers, the champagne toasts, the press. All of it fell away in a single breath. She moved through the city like a shadow in borrowed clothes. The telegrams, the headlines, the crowds, none of it mattered anymore. She had crossed an ocean, but she had come to no safe shore. There was one final reception in her honor. The flowers were arranged, a speech had been written. Photographers waited. She arrived. She smiled. She said thank you. She raised a glass, but she wasn't really there. A suite had been booked for her aboard the Queen Mary. First class, beautiful, isolated. She boarded without ceremony, without entourage, just a suitcase, a coat, and the engine still turning softly in the back of her mind. She didn't wave from the deck. She didn't linger. She simply left. Somewhere between Halifax and Southampton, a man from Columbia Pictures approached her on the deck. He asked if she would play herself in a film about the flight. Her name in lights, the great adventure on the silver screen. She agreed. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps to end the conversation. Perhaps because it didn't matter. Most of the voyage she kept to herself. She sat alone at meals, spoke little, read less. She spent long hours at the rail, watching the sea slide past, dark, endless, unyielding. She had crossed this ocean once already, but from above it had looked smaller. From here it looked infinite. In the stillness, she remembered another sky. Africa at dusk. The smell of cedar and smoke. Dennis reading Homer by firelight. Tom running beside her through the mist, his hands on the fuel lines, always one step ahead of her fear. Her father, silent at sunrise, watching the horizon. And Kibi, standing beside a foal, quiet and steady. That had been silence too, once, but it had never felt like this. Then the letters began to arrive. Not in handfuls, but in waves, from generals and schoolchildren, from women who had whispered her name with reverence, from strangers who had never flown, but who knew what courage looked like. There were offers, appearances, theater contracts. A producer offered her £500 a week to appear in a musical as the first transatlantic passenger. They called her brave. They called her beautiful. Birdwoman, the lone flyer, the real Lady Lindy. The British press quoted lords and admirals. American newspapers ran her face on front pages for days. She read their words, folded their letters. She smiled, but she didn't quite believe them. Because she knew what the flight had really been. She had done what no woman had done before. what only a handful of men had dared. She had chased the edge of the world, and for one fragile moment, caught it. And though the world would remember the fuel, the distance, the landing, the headline, she would remember something else. Not the glory, not the crash, not even the storm. She would remember the silence, the shape of the dark, the ache in her hands, the sound of the engine, straining starting to give, the flicker of dawn breaking through the cloud. The moment when land rose from the mist like a promise she hadn't dared believe in. That, more than the cheers, the headlines, or the history, was what stayed with her, a quiet ache, shadowed by the loss of the man who had once dreamed this with her, whose approval had always been the one she sought most. And in the stillness that followed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she still wasn't enough. When Beryl returned to England, the applause was still waiting for her. She arrived to a hero's welcome. Flashbulbs, flowers, civic receptions, open cars. She smiled and waved, posed beside the ship's rail, and answered the same questions she'd been asked for weeks. Her laugh was polite, her gaze distant. The cheers still rose, but her heart had gone quiet. The moment she could, she sought out Edgar Percival, the man who had built her plane, and asked the only question that mattered. "Tell me everything." It was the first time she heard the full story of how Tom had died. "A foot either way," Percival said, "and he would have lived." He had been cautious, measured, precise, the sort of man who once told her, "You can't fly on emotion." Now he was gone. Later that week, she visited Desi. They sat in the house Tom had loved. White walls, blue shutters, silver trophies lined up like ghosts. Beryl had no money, no home, and nowhere else to go. She asked if she could stay. Desi said yes. Some days passed in silence, others with clipped conversation. One afternoon, Desi found a telegram tucked in a chest of drawers. "Darling, is it true you are to marry Florence Desmond? Please answer. Stop. Heartbroken. Beryl." She never brought it up. She didn't need to. Beryl drifted through London society in borrowed clothes, dining on charm and debt, lingering in rooms where she no longer belonged and no one quite knew what to say to her. At a dinner party, she slipped a note to Charles Hughesdon, unaware he was courting Desi. "Come find me later," it read. He showed it to Desi. No words were exchanged, but something between them quietly fractured. Within days, Beryl moved out, not in anger, but with inevitability. She declared bankruptcy, settling with creditors for a fraction of what she owed. Still, she kept reaching. A new transatlantic race was proposed, New York to Paris. The prize was enormous. She made inquiries, but interest waned, sponsors vanished, and the race disappeared before it ever began. She returned to America. There were studio visits, a film in discussion, and a proposal from Columbia that she play herself. She screen tested. It didn't go well, and the project was quietly shelved. She remained in Los Angeles longer than expected, not for the career, not for the parties, but because she was waiting, hoping Amelia Earhart would return from her round-the-world flight. Beryl simply wished to see her land. A nod, a smile, something wordless and true between two women who had once chased the same sky. But Amelia never came home. While the world searched the Pacific, Beryl sat in the garden of Jacqueline Cochran's estate. Jackie, another accomplished pilot, claimed to be clairvoyant and that she had seen Amelia's wreckage in a vision and that she was alive. However, 2 days later, she had another vision and told the press that Amelia was now dead. Even Beryl was asked to speak. "Miss Earhart's loss," she said, "is all Aviation's." There were parties, introductions to stars, and a brief stint as technical advisor on Safari. She met Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and through him, his father, by then married to the notorious Sylvia Ashley. The meetings meant little, and by year's end, Beryl boarded a ship bound for Africa. There were no reporters, no farewell, no fanfare, just another quiet crossing that slipped by unnoticed. The next few years blurred. She returned briefly to Kenya. She worked, rode, and lived quietly, but the world had stopped asking for her, and the silence, once a refuge, had grown heavy. By late 1939, she was back in California, entering another winter of borrowed time. One evening, at a party, she saw a familiar face. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, aviator, exile, and poet, was in Los Angeles working on Flight to Arras. They spoke softly, and without fanfare, he said what no one else had dared. "You should write your story," she shrugged. "I haven't done anything worth writing about." "You're wrong," he replied. And so, she began. It started in fragments, scraps of memory, the Rift Valley at dawn, a lion's breath in the tall grass, Dennis reading poetry beside the fire, and the silence in the sky before a storm. She didn't call it a book. She didn't show it to anyone. She simply remembered, letting the images fall into place one quiet hour at a time. Saint-Exupéry encouraged her to send the outline to his agent in New York. A few chapters followed. Then more. By 1940, her money was running low. The small annuity she received from the Crown could only be accessed in sterling zones, so she traveled to the Bahamas and stayed in a white house called The Retreat. Unassuming, serene, and shaded by palm trees. Her days were simple: riding, swimming, typing. She wrote on a veranda with dogs at her feet and palm fronds brushing the windows, and this time the words came with rhythm and assurance. She reconnected briefly with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, now exiled in Nassau, and found them dull, their charm worn thin against the isolation of their new reality. During a return to Hollywood, she met Raoul Schumacher. He was 5 years younger, charming, bright-eyed, a minor writer with more confidence than success, and in Beryl's eyes that confidence mattered more than pedigree. They fell quickly in love. He supported her, edited her pages, and slept beside her typewriter as she worked late into the night. Later, some would claim he had written the book, but the voice, clear, precise, unsentimental, was hers. She had begun it long before they met, and his contributions, though supportive, were light and structural rather than lyrical. What mattered most was that he believed in her, and in that fragile moment, she needed belief more than anything else in the world. She sent the manuscript to Paul Brooks at Houghton Mifflin in Boston. He called it a masterpiece. The title changed, from Wings Over the Jungle to something quieter, more assured, West with the Night. It was published in 1942, and she dedicated it to her father. Critics adored it. They called it bold, original, unlike anything written about Africa. Even Hemingway, famously stingy with praise, famously said, "She can write rings around all of us who consider ourselves writers." But the timing was wrong. The world was at war, and there was no oxygen left for poetry. The book sold modestly, then not at all. It vanished from shelves, from conversation, from memory. The woman who once circled continents, one reviewer later wrote, vanished from bookshelves without a sound. That same year, Beryl finally granted Mansfield a divorce, and in October of 1942, she married Raoul. It should have marked a beginning, but the money never came. They moved often, sustained by borrowed favors and fading optimism. At one point, Beryl sold her Kenyan property for just £400. A decade later, it would be worth $40,000. She continued to write. Her first short story appeared in Ladies' Home Journal in 1943. Others followed. Some carried her unmistakable voice, clear, unsentimental, assured. Others, especially the last two, did not. They were almost certainly Raoul's. Their tone echoed his own work, The Whip Hand, well-informed, but lacking her resonance. In the beginning, the marriage was lighthearted, matching shirts, matching hats, a horse, a cat, 2 Nubian goats. They settled in Pasadena, hosting soirees attended by the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, along with others drawn to their eccentric charm. But the cracks appeared quickly. Raoul drank. Beryl, disillusioned, drifted. In time, he would claim he had written every word of West with the Night, though all evidence disproved him. By July 1941, half the manuscript had already been delivered to the publisher, months before he had entered the story. He had affairs, mostly with men. Beryl, ever practical, took her own. She began to dominate the relationship. He began to recede from it. By the spring of 1945, with the war drawing to a close and Raoul released from Coast Guard service, Beryl longed for stillness, horses, sunlight, and the illusion of permanence. Through a friend, they discovered a ranch in Toro Canyon, nestled in the hills above Santa Barbara. The house belonged to Leopold Stokowski, Garbo's companion, and more recently, Gloria Vanderbilt's lover. For a time, Beryl and Raoul lived there rent-free, caretakers of a paradise they would never own. They rode in the mornings, rode in the afternoons, and welcomed guests beneath eucalyptus trees and the soft spill of California light. At 44, Beryl moved through Santa Barbara society like a force of nature, striking, remote, and entirely herself. Men gravitated toward her. Women circled at a distance. That summer, her son arrived from England. 16, tall and reserved, he was a stranger to her in nearly every way. He had admired her from afar his whole life, but the reunion was strained. Beryl was unsettled by what he represented. Not only a past she had walked away from, but time itself. She kept him hidden at the ranch. A family friend later recalled being asked to buy him clothes, as Beryl did not want to be seen with him. She didn't mother him. Perhaps she didn't know how, and yet Gervais never spoke ill of her. Back at Toro Canyon, the marriage was decaying. Raoul drank too much. Beryl strayed too far. The charm that had once bound them gave way to suspicion, resentment, and the dull ache of unmet expectations. He caught her with another man. The confrontation was fierce. What had once been fire and flirtation had curdled into something closer to survival. They both took lovers. Raoul's remained male. Beryl tolerated it until he questioned hers. Then all bets were off. One day, Beryl had had enough, and she phoned a casual acquaintance to come and get him. The friend drove to a hotel in Santa Barbara. Beryl arrived, opened the car door, and let Raoul, emaciated, silent, spill onto the pavement. She said nothing and simply drove away. He told friends she had nearly destroyed him, that her words, her detachment, her unyielding control had broken something essential in him. And yet, he returned to her. They tried to write again, but whatever magic had once existed between them had long since evaporated. A few short stories reached print, some by Raoul, and one final piece by Beryl, The Quitter, published in Cosmopolitan with the help of a friend. It would be the last work ever to appear under her name. They separated, quietly, finally. Beryl remained at the ranch a while longer, nearly penniless and emotionally worn. Invitations to dinner became lifelines. She drifted from one friend's home to another, still carrying herself with an elegance that seemed undiminished by fatigue. After Toro Canyon, she stayed briefly with Sir Charles Mendel in Beverly Hills. Later, she took up with a folk singer in a coastal village, spending her days collecting driftwood, while he composed songs she didn't entirely believe in. She called it a dream she didn't quite trust. Among her scattered papers from this time were letters from Frank Sinatra and even Joseph Kennedy offering financial advice. There were glimmers, but no fire. In 1960, she and Raoul divorced. He died 2 years later of a heart attack at 55. Long before the divorce, Beryl had resumed using the name Markham. Some among the Markham family were outraged, but she never wavered. It was the name she had flown under, the name she had written under, the name her son bore. It was, she said, both logical and moral. By 1949, Beryl Markham was nearly spent. Her marriage had collapsed, her health was fragile, and her career, fame, and fortune had all slipped away. More than anything, she longed for Africa. She had no money, no plan, only instinct. An old friend, Lord Delamere, quietly arranged her fare to South Africa. After a brief stop in London, she arrived at the Cape with nothing more than a suitcase and a reputation, turning up unannounced on the doorstep of writers Stewart and Tiny Clote. They welcomed her in. For a time, it worked. She typed late into the night, assisted Stewart with his drafts, and tried to steady herself in the quiet rituals of literary work. But eventually, something fractured. Beryl submitted one of his stories under her own name to their shared agent. When the same story arrived from Clote himself, confusion gave way to scandal. She left abruptly. Afterward, Tiny noticed missing silks, vanished cosmetics, and unfamiliar charges to their accounts. It wasn't the first bridge Beryl had burned. Friends, credit, goodwill, she used them like rations, and eventually, they ran out. She next went to Durban, staying briefly with her father, Charles Clutterbuck, now a respected racehorse trainer. But the reunion proved uneasy. She clashed with his partner, Emma, and the tension mounted until Charles, trying to help, gave her just enough money to purchase an old Buick and fuel it for a long, solitary drive north. She crossed the continent alone, and in April 1950 she returned to Kenya. But Kenya had changed. The Mau Mau rebellion had begun, and fear had replaced the old colonial ease. Suspicion lingered even among long-trusted servants. Farms were fortified and gates locked at sundown. The place Beryl had known no longer existed. She drifted between guest rooms and borrowed beds, always immaculately dressed, always a little too glamorous for her circumstances. Then, one evening in Nairobi, she met Charles and Doreen Bathurst Norman. At a formal gathering, she pulled Doreen aside and said simply, "I have no money, and nowhere to go. Without hesitation, they offered her their guest cottage. It was a curious invitation. Her reputation had preceded her. Beautiful, scandalous, unpredictable. But the next morning she arrived in a worn raincoat and Wellington boots, with no perfume, no theatrics, only quiet need. The women became fast friends. More unexpectedly, Beryl grew close to the Bathurst Norman children, Victoria and George. She taught them poker and backgammon by lamplight, sang along to Burl Ives records, and told stories of horses and faraway places. Not once did she mention her solo flight, her book, or the name she had once made famous. With them, Doreen recalled, she was simply Beryl. Forest Farm sat on the slopes of Mount Kenya, where cedar forests met glacial streams and the air smelled of thyme and snowmelt. It was not a home, but a refuge. Yet peace, as ever, proved fleeting. Severe fibroids and the aftermath of poorly performed abortions led to a hysterectomy. She refused to recover in a hospital. The next morning, barefoot and in her pajamas, she broke up a dog fight in the yard, striding between the animals, seizing them by the scruff, hurling them apart and returning to bed. Her body was healing, but her mind was not. She smashed windows, imagined betrayals. In a fury, she once struck Charles. He struck her back. "If this continues," he warned, "you'll have to go." But Doreen refused to send her away. She had nowhere else, she said. As the Mau Mau uprising intensified, the children were sent to England. The farm remained under threat. Cattle vanished, fires burned on the nearby hills. Then came Jorgen Thrain, a Dane, tall, fair, and soft-spoken. He had come to Kenya with 10 shillings in his pocket and only 2 English words, yes and no. But he had grit. He learned Swahili, worked every kind of field, and dreamed of building something of his own. Beryl met him during a visit to a neighboring farm, and when Charles offered him a job, half in jest, Jorgen accepted without hesitation. He moved into Forest Farm and quietly into Beryl's life. Jorgen didn't dazzle. He didn't flatter. He simply showed up, each morning for every chore and in all the silent hours that demanded endurance more than words. When Beryl had someone she could trust, Doreen later said, her insecurity took time off. With Jorgen beside her, she began to recover, not only from illness, but from years of emotional drift. A friend gave her a ruined racehorse. She brought it back to health. It never won, but it ran, and in that, something stirred. She decided to train again. She had no stables, no clients, no money, but she had conviction. With £1,500, likely from her father in Mansfield, she purchased a 25-acre plot beside the Bathurst Normans. She named it Karinga. As the Mau Mau crisis escalated, authorities forbade her from living alone. Jorgen moved in, for protection and for something more. She brought back her old farmhand, Arap Ruda, who now drank too much, but she kept him on. In 1955, her son Gervais passed through Kenya with his young wife. They stayed briefly at Karinga. The visit was warm, but it would be the last time she saw him. And then in 1957, her father died. He had remained in South Africa, training horses to the end. He still rose before dawn to walk the paddocks, still believed in silence, in steadiness, in doing the work without applause. Age had thinned him, but it had not softened him. They had not been close, not in the conventional sense, but no one had shaped her more. When the telegram arrived, she said nothing. She did not cry. She did not attend the funeral. But for days afterward, she rose early. She walked the track alone. She brushed the horses herself. She corrected Arap Ruta more gently, fed the dogs more often, and smoked fewer cigarettes. She spoke no grief aloud, but something inside her closed. Her father was gone, and with him, the last person who had known her story from the beginning. Not the headlines, not the myth, but the girl in the dust, the child in the rondavel, the hands that could braid a mane better than they could hold a pencil. She inherited nothing but memory, but he had left her something else. Something quieter, harder to name. He had given her grit, the kind that carries on without comfort, without applause, without anyone watching. And now Beryl was rising again. She leased her first crop of horses. She had no capital, only faith and hard work. On New Year's Day 1959, Beryl won the Kenya St. Leger, the same race she had claimed 33 years before. She was back, not famous, not rich, but her own horse, in her own colors and her own name, Markham, once again in the winner's circle. The 1959-60 racing season in Kenya belonged to her. With a modest stable and no major financial backer, She challenged the giants of East African racing and won, not with numbers, but with stakes. Her filly Niagara had already taken the Kenya Guineas, the first leg of the Triple Crown. Now all eyes turned to the East African Derby. Ridden by the quiet, unassuming jockey Tony Thomas, Niagara surged past the field in the final half mile. Effortless, unchallenged, in record time, the Derby was hers. Next came the St. Leger, and Niagara triumphed again, her 5th consecutive win, securing Kenya's Triple Crown. The last horse to achieve that feat had been trained by her father more than 25 years before. By early 1960, Beryl was not only the most talked-about trainer in Kenya, she sat at the top of the trainer standings, a position she would hold for 6 consecutive years. And all of it had been built from nothing. No fortune, no team, no safety net, only grit, instinct, and the quiet loyalty of those who believed in her. Success brought owners to her door, and Beryl, now a perfectionist, demanded everything. Her stable had become a force. Jorgen Thrain remained her anchor, steady, capable, endlessly patient. When she barked, he answered with quiet amusement. If she said, "I want a gallop laid here," he had it cleared and leveled within days. If she snapped, "That door is the wrong shade of blue, you fool," he simply repainted it. Arap Ruda and Arthur Orchardson, too, played their part in the legend she was becoming. In July 1960, Jorgen took a brief holiday to Scandinavia. While there, he watched a young Irish jockey named Ryan Buster Parnell, who had already ridden nearly 300 winners across Northern Europe. Jorgen telephoned him that afternoon. "Would you come to Nairobi and ride for Beryl this weekend?" "That might be difficult," Buster replied. "I'm supposed to be getting married on Saturday." "Sunday will do," Jorgen said. Beryl didn't know it yet, but the second act of her legend was just beginning. When Buster Parnell arrived in Kenya in August 1960, he had no idea that leaving Europe would lead him into a partnership that would come to define East African racing. That changed the moment he met Beryl. She entered the room, he recalled, and her presence was overwhelming. She didn't hesitate. "I've got 8 horses racing this weekend," she said. "I'll put you on 2. "I'll ride all 8, Buster replied, "or I'm on the next flight back to Denmark." Her smile was slow and sharp. "Yes, sweetie, that's exactly what I said. You ride the 8, and he did. He won 6, placed in the rest, and the following weekend at the East African Derby rode 9 of her horses and won 8, an achievement still spoken of with awe. From 1959 to 1964, Beryl's stable became the gold standard. She rose before dawn, always immaculate, jodhpurs tailored like evening wear, boots gleaming, silk shirts crisp as chilled champagne. Mornings in Nairobi shimmered with precision. 40 horses moved through the mist like soldiers in formation, each one responsive to her eye, her tone, her perfectionism. "She worked me harder than anyone," Buster said, "but I learned more from her than from anyone else in my life. She ruled her world with elegance and severity. Money bored her. Excellence thrilled her. The bills at the Muthaiga Club went unpaid. Every shilling returned to the horses. Even her pleasures were precise. She didn't unwind. She functioned like clockwork, wrapped in silk, but the shimmer began to dim. In 1964, Beryl made a bold and unexpected move. She partnered with Lady Enid Kenmare, a woman whose fortune was matched only by her notoriety. Born Enid Lindemann, she had been married 4 times, each union wealthier and shorter than the last. She was once Lady Furness, later the Countess of Kenmare, and depending on who you asked, either the most glamorous widow in Europe or the most dangerous. Whispers surrounded her, that she had hastened her husband's exits, that death followed wherever she settled. Enid neither confirmed nor denied any of it. She didn't need to. She and Beryl were not friends, but they understood each other. Neither was known for getting on with other women. Both were survivors. Both, in their own way, were mythic. Together, they built a stable entirely run by women, funded by Enid's fortune and driven by Beryl's control. The estate they acquired, Broadlands, sat just outside Cape Town. 400 acres of orchards, paddocks, and a white-walled Cape Dutch house behind iron gates. The horses arrived after a sweltering sea voyage, overheated, dehydrated, shaken. It took weeks to restore them. Jorgen Thrain helped Beryl settle in. Then, as quietly as he had arrived, he returned to Kenya. His absence hit harder than she ever admitted. Without him, her temper sharpened, her mood turned brittle. The charm turned cold. At first, Broadlands still delivered. Beryl produced results. The press adored the imagery, the first all-female racing stable. But the cracks were forming. Lady Kenmare hosted elegant dinners for bishops and dukes. Beryl arrived last, trailed by her Great Danes, gliding into the room like a challenge. One night, her dogs and Enid's pugs waged war beneath the linen-clad table. Silverware trembled. "Enid, I do wish you'd control your dogs, darling," Beryl said without glancing down. It was the beginning of the end. She rode staff hard. When a groom was thrown and broke her arm, Beryl rode past, muttered, "Bloody fool," and carried on. She would have said the same to herself, and meant it. The stud manager clashed with her methods. Gallops were mismanaged. Horses went lame. Enid, aging and ill, grew weary of what she saw as defiance. Beryl, fiercely independent, bristled at being treated like a servant. The partnership, brilliant on paper, dissolved without drama. Beryl packed her remaining horses and left Broadlands behind. She drifted, from borrowed stables to borrowed time. The glamour was gone. At 66, she crossed into Rhodesia. There were no staff, no owners, no allies. Her finances were scattered across handshakes and memory. She clashed with officials, alienated the racing board, and fought on instinct alone. One friend recalled writing a workout for her. When the horse failed to impress a prospective buyer, Beryl calmly doused him with a bucket of cold water. She hadn't changed, he said, but the world had. Disillusioned, she longed for home. For the Rift Valley, for the red earth and the sharp air, for the mornings she had once galloped through barefoot and laughing, when the sky seemed endless and the days refused to end, where she had once walked barefoot, untamed, unbeaten, with her loyal dog trailing behind. In Kenya, she was Beryl again. Her horses won, as they always had, and her name once more stirred admiration. She was the brave girl who dared while others fell, the one who hunted with warriors, who never backed down, the girl they once called in Kikuyu, the child who could not fall off a horse. The name had been given by Kibi long ago, in a past that now drifted somewhere between memory and myth. But in other ways, she fell. Life, in its brutal, unforgiving rhythm, stormed in. In 1971, her only son, Gervais, was killed in a car accident in France. She did not go to the funeral. In her lifetime, the only one she had attended was for Dennis. And as with so many losses in her life, she said nothing. She didn't speak of it, not to her friends, not even to those who might have understood. Stoicism had been her father's first lesson, riding through a land that rewarded silence more than sentiment, where pain was endured, not expressed. Perhaps it was in those childhood years, when her mother had disappeared and left no explanation, that Beryl first discovered the shelter of quiet. Perhaps it was in the endless hours waiting for a train whistle that never came, waiting for a mother who would never return, that she learned what it meant to lose and say nothing. And perhaps she never forgave that absence, but she had repeated it. She had never truly been a mother to him, had never offered the kind of closeness that could have tethered them across years and oceans. And now with him gone, it became one ocean she could not cross. He had watched her from afar, with a kind of detached pride, admiring the exploits of a woman he could never reach, never understand. And now he, too, was gone. Another man lost to time. Like Dennis, like Tom, like her father. And the world Beryl once inhabited, a world that had once felt limitless, as wide as the sky and as open as the plains, had begun to contract, folding in on itself, smaller and smaller with each passing year. Still she trained, still she rode. Every Tuesday her blue Mercedes drifted down Mataiga's bougainvillea-lined roads. I saw her often, the Duchess of Portland said, but I never really knew her. No one did. She wasn't cold, the Duchess added. Just apart. People didn't matter to her, the way animals did. In 1983, at 80, Beryl trained her last winter. No ceremony, no photographs, just another gallop, another horse in the ring, another stride, and then, quietly, she walked away. In her final years, Beryl Markham lived in genteel decline. When Nairobi solicitor Jack Couldry was sent to serve her a writ, he found her living in quiet squalor. Though they'd never met, his family had known hers, and Jack, godson of her first husband, Jock, felt compelled to help, and he organized a small fund supported by figures from the racing and aviation worlds. From that point on, Jack managed her modest affairs. In the early 1980s, Beryl moved into a simple cottage on the grounds of the Nairobi racecourse, graciously offered rent-free by the Jockey Club. From her window, she could watch horses graze. Every morning, grooms arrived at her doorstep for instructions. Beryl, now in her 80s, would still drive her Mercedes to the stables to oversee the training of horses, always attuned to each animal's individual needs. Then, one morning in August 1981, her grooms arrived, but Beryl did not. After some time, a neighbor forced open her door and found her bound with a telephone cord, bruised and barely able to speak. She had been beaten during a robbery. Her beloved dogs were eventually found, terrified, hiding under her bed. Despite the trauma, her possessions stolen, her body battered, Beryl carried on. Yet time, at last, began to show its hand. She still trained a small string of horses, still smiled with youthful mischief when she chose, still flashed the charm that had dazzled continents, but there was a stiffness in her walk now, and a faint brittleness in her strength. She refused to part with her horses, even as Jack Coudry gently insisted she could no longer afford them. The question of money never much concerned Beryl, nor did she ask where Jack found the funds to keep her afloat. Quietly, Jack persuaded the British trustees managing a long-standing fund to increase her stipend, an act of pure generosity outside the fund's strict terms. Then, in December 1982, a letter arrived from California. The writer, George Gutekunst, told Beryl of a day spent trout fishing with Jack Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway's son. Jack had urged him to read his father's letters. Among them, George found something astonishing: Hemingway's rapturous praise for West with the Night. "She has written so well and so marvelously well that I was simply ashamed of myself as a writer," Hemingway confessed. "This girl can write rings around all of us." That tribute, so rare from the famously caustic Hemingway, inspired Gutekunst to track down a copy of Beryl's book, read it twice in 2 days, and pass it to North Point Press. The result, West with the Night, was republished in 1983 to widespread acclaim, rescuing Beryl from obscurity and restoring her literary reputation. Yet even this praise had shadows. Gutekunst had gently omitted Hemingway's barbed aside, that Beryl, a high-grade bitch, had left out certain truths that might destroy the character of the heroine. What Hemingway meant remains speculation. He had only known Beryl briefly while recovering in Nairobi, and much of his opinion likely came from gossip. Some whispered she had rejected his advances. Perhaps that was reason enough for his scorn. Whatever the cause, Hemingway's grudging admiration helped reintroduce Beryl to the world, not just as a horse trainer or pioneering aviatrix, but as a brilliant writer. It was a resurrection that, for once, she did not fight. To everyone's surprise, West with the Night was met with rapture. Critics declared it one of the great literary rediscoveries of the decade. "I thought it couldn't possibly be as good as all that," Beryl remarked in a rare interview. "But if people like it, so much the better." As acclaim mounted, a shadow fell over the celebrations. Anonymous calls were made to publishers and magazines, claiming Beryl hadn't written the book at all. That credit belonged to her former husband, Raoul Schumacher. But this contradicts existing correspondence between Beryl and Houghton Mifflin, which proves she was in direct contact with the publisher as early as 1941, sending batches of manuscript from Nassau, long before Raoul's involvement. And while Raoul edited West with the Night with skill, perhaps brilliantly, he was not its author. His own published fiction is stylistically inferior and entirely distinct from the lyrical prose of Beryl's memoir, but none of this truly discredited her voice. The book's soul, its vivid imagery, sharp instincts, and poetic restraint, was unmistakably Beryl's. Whether polished by another or not, West with the Night was born of her experience, her eye, and her singular way of moving through the world. And perhaps, after everything, after horses and flights, scandals and silences, that was the truest legacy she could leave. As the American writer Kay Boyle observed, West with the Night is simply too vivid, too personal, and too impassioned to have been written secondhand. And that, perhaps, is the final triumph. After a life lived on her own terms, it is her words that endure. In the end, West with the Night is not merely a memoir. It is a distillation of a singular spirit. Detailed, impassioned, and utterly original, it could only have come from Beryl Markham. Those who knew her never doubted it. Shortly after the republication of West with the Night, a documentary on her life was proposed, as well as a feature film. But Beryl's health was faltering. She had recently endured a hospital stay, her frame gaunt, her strength dimmed. Friends worried, yet soon she was back at the racetrack, thin, but walking with the same defiant grace. With the growing public interest in Out of Africa, the film adaptation of Karen Blixen's memoir, Beryl's own name resurfaced in the global imagination. She was represented in the film, lightly and inaccurately, as a minor character named Felicity, but journalists were now keen to hear from the real woman. Filming, however, proved difficult. Beryl was unpredictable on camera, evasive, easily annoyed, and clearly uncomfortable under the spotlight. She loathed crowds and refused to speak about her past with anything resembling performance. "Oh, I'm fed up with this. I'm going," she once snapped on set. Her answers often rambled, possibly by design. She had never been one to boast, nor did she relish rehashing her liaisons and adventures. What she offered freely to close friends, she guarded fiercely from the public eye. Only a few scenes of Beryl ultimately made it into the final documentary. One captured her at dawn, pacing the racetrack during morning workouts. There, among the grooms and horses, she was at home. Tall and fair-haired, her movements now slowed by age. She wore a pale blue shirt, denim trousers, and a bright shawl over her shoulders. A subtle flash of her former chic. Cameras forgotten, her eyes followed a galloping horse with unwavering focus. Her face, in that moment, was all discipline and instinct. Pure horsewoman. Another scene showed her on the veranda of her cottage, tracing old flight paths across a weathered aviation chart. "Nairobi, Kilimanjaro, Naivasha, Nairobi," she recited softly, her finger moving with practiced ease. In the final shot, she smiles and waves from the window of a modern plane en route to Njoro, a brief, haunting echo of the young woman who once stepped into the Vega Gull nearly half a century before. The resulting documentary, World Without Walls, premiered in San Francisco in January 1986. Quiet, lyrical, and meditative, it offered a glimpse into a life that defied convention and gravity alike. Though West with the Night had previously garnered critical praise, it had not sold widely. Its modest early run sold just 9,100 copies in the first year, rising to 15,000 by the end of 1985. But when World Without Walls aired, bookstores across the Bay Area sold out overnight. North Point Press rushed to reprint, and within months, sales soared past 100,000. Despite the acclaim and growing global interest in West with the Night, the money filtered slowly into Beryl's account. Royalties arrived sporadically, often months behind sales. So while the world was rediscovering Beryl Markham, she remained only modestly better off. And in the end, she was forced to let go of her last 3 horses. That autumn, on Kenyatta Day, Beryl collapsed. Her longtime houseboy found her unconscious on the floor of her cottage, victim of a massive thrombosis. But Beryl did not die. She lingered for weeks, silent at first, but with a fierce glint in her eyes. Her legs swelled painfully. "Hideous," she whispered, looking at her once slender feet with horror. Though she slowly regained strength, she could no longer walk unaided and was confined to her armchair. Her 2 servants cared for her, as did a nurse who visited regularly, though Beryl bristled at being treated like a 2-year-old. Visitors still came, some to interview her, others simply to shake her hand or ask for an autograph. In early April, with staggering will, she began to walk again, just a little. Standing on her veranda, tall and slim, she looked suddenly ageless. On April 6th, Derby Day in Nairobi, Beryl decided, on a whim, that she would attend. It was her first outing since her collapse. She dressed with care. Pale blue denim trousers, a silk shirt, and a vivid scarf in shades of pink and cerise. A soft leather blouse and jacket completed the look. Her hair, silvered and styled, caught the sun, Her nails were glossed red. Her skin still glowed, unmarked by age or heat. For a brief, triumphant moment, Beryl Markham, aviator, horse trainer, rider, was radiant once more. Though she could walk a little with effort, her seat, thoughtfully arranged by the Jockey Club, was on the high terrace of the Owners, Breeders, and Trainers Club. The climb was impossible without help. A young man offered to lift her. Beryl laughed as he swept her into his arms. But halfway down the narrow stone stairs after the races, he missed a wet patch. They tumbled together to the bottom. Though no bones were broken, Beryl was badly bruised. The group returned her to her cottage to await the doctor. Sedated, Beryl slept well that night. Better, her friends said, than she had in months. The fall became a chance for care. Her doctor admitted her to hospital for x-rays and observation. Beryl, who loathed hospitals, bore it well. Her 2 dogs were brought in daily, and she would have a mid-afternoon vodka mixed with orange juice. As the 50th anniversary of her transatlantic flight approached, plans took shape. The RAF, Smith's Industries, Castrol, and the province of Nova Scotia commissioned a bronze model of the Vega Gull. It was to be presented to Beryl at Abingdon on the anniversary. There was little hope she'd make the journey, but she talked often of the trip. But in late July, Beryl tripped over her dog Tookie in her cottage. She fell, and this time, her hip was broken and she required an operation. Beryl, who was sure her hip was fine, argued vehemently with doctors, but in the end, she was persuaded to undergo the operation. After the operation, Beryl briefly rallied. She was cheerful and sharp, but 2 days later, she was moved to intensive care. It was pneumonia. And even Beryl, who had so often defied odds, could not fight that and slipped away quietly in the early hours of August 3, 1986. A month later, on September 4th, the 50th anniversary of her historic flight, a Thanksgiving service was held at St. Clement Danes Church in London. The day, unlike the stormy one she had flown into all those years before, was golden and clear. Sunlight poured through the stained glass, illuminating great white chrysanthemums tied with ribbons in Beryl's racing colors. The pews were filled with people from every chapter of her life: aviators, authors, jockeys, old friends from Kenya, California, and the far corners of the British Isles. George Bathurst Norman stood to speak. As a boy, he had learned to play cards at her table in Nairobi. Now older, reverent, fighting emotion, he offered a final tribute. She was like no one else I have ever known, before or since. There was something elemental in her. She belonged to the wind, the horses, the open spaces. She never compromised, not even with time. Beryl Markham was cremated. Her ashes were scattered across the fields she once rode with her father, through the soil she walked beside Kibi, and into the skies she shared with Tom and Dennis, flying forever in the wind. The girl who had longed for freedom, for silence, for solitude, had become part of it. No stone was raised in her name, no monument marks her place. But in the soil of the Rift Valley, in the skies that stretch wide and unconquerable, she rises. She is there in the sunlight, in the mist, in the hush before a gallop, in the motion of wings, flowing forever through time. As Beryl once wrote in the softest line of her memoir, "I wonder if the life that I am living is not really the dream I dreamed when I was 10. And there, in that dream, Beryl lives forever. The barefoot child who roamed freely through the plains, waiting silently for a mother who would never return. The teenage girl who outrode men, earning her the nickname, the girl who could not fall. And the fearless woman who crossed oceans through storms, flying into legend. There in the valley that raised her, she is home, finally, forever, free." Thank you for watching this week's story on Beryl Markham. What did you think of Beryl's life? What do you think of her accomplishments? Why do you think she was so reluctant to be involved with her son? And why, to this day, do so many people believe she didn't write West with the Night? YouTube often favors short, 15-minute highlight reels. But when I created this channel, I wanted to do something different. I wanted to tell the real stories, the triumphs, the tragedies, the brilliance, and the flaws. Not just names and dates, but full lives, full women. We're not a studio, we're not a big company, we're just a small channel with a big mission to tell women's stories the way they deserve to be told. So if this resonated with you, your likes, your comments, your shares, and your subscriptions mean the world. They help us keep going, and they help others discover these stories too. And thank you to our patrons and channel members. You are the heart of this work, the mythic men and women who help keep this dream alive. The dream of telling the truth beyond the scandal, of showing women not just in fragments, but in full flight. Velocity Girl, Zen Life 68, Jillian Barker, Kimberly Ray, Philip Gallegos, Kingsley Clark, Kafum Chung, Harry Thurston, Anna Livy, Michelle Lynn Neal, Karen Craig, Bavia Andrea, Tracy Walsh, Joy McGuire, Elizabeth, CTS Bathory, America Marie, Amanda Lynn Snowball, The Inappropriate Heifer, Kendra McNally, Marianne Nelson, Deborah Shepard, Ida Kloster Jensen, Kay Philomene, Jules Mack, Real Steel Magnolia, Maureen Tallman, Black Knight 5897, Sammy Lott, Karen Possible, Joanne Thomas Yakedo, Deborah Chmielewski, Steve Weinstein, Joya, Supreme, Laura Lamond, Beverly Cox Thompson, DDH, Beth Dawson, Stephanie Warren Smith, Sue Whitaker, PB, Monica, Krista Schaefer Hazlett, Marcy Joe, Wendy Fairfull, Trudy DeSwart, T. Monroe, Catherine Wolfe, Janet Phelps, Roxanne Schuster, Kathleen Martin, Marina Barron, Melissa Pouliot, Kelly Brown, Gwen, Melissa Gilmore, Kelly Patwell, Marcia Corbin, Lisa Karen, Catherine Ratensky Harrison, Michael Nelson, Black Cat Tarot, Chrissy Bethune, and Hesta Kirsten. Thank you. And a special shout out to this week's trivia winners, Jan Murray, 3155, Lisa Craig, 4585, and Corpse Bride. Congratulations to you all. You were all so fast, I'm not sure who was first. And finally, to all the silent men and women out there watching until the last note plays on the video, thank you. Until next week, stay curious, stay strong, keep exploring history. And as always, thanks for watching Mythic Women.